Welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast, the podcast where we explore national and local issues, diving into the things that matter to you in a non-confrontational and investigative way to hopefully get to the heart of the matter. This is Sunday, the 2nd of February. The 11 weeks of January are over, and I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury, and that January is quite a kicker, isn't it?
Oh, wasn't it just? And it was that, I know calendars are a random thing and we can't blame anybody for them, but the fact that payday fell on Friday the 31st, it was like, oh, couldn't you just cut us a break and have it fall on a Sunday? So it did feel like it lasted forever. But here we are in February. Evenings will be getting lighter. There's the roller coaster of the Portsmouth City Council budget come later in the month. But this evening we are looking back, brackets, hopefully not in anger.
I see what you did there. That's a nice tee in. So 5 years ago, or more precisely 11 p.m. on the 31st of January 2020 was an historic moment and a seminal point in history, and we wanted today to celebrate those things that happened that day and what's happened since. So what are we celebrating in?
Well, and again, it's amazing, isn't it? In this world of social media and misinformation, you put up a perfectly sensible post about Brexit, a celebration 5 years on. And the number of people who got very, very frothy about the whole affair and thought we'd be here in Union Jack waistcoats in the style of Nigel, no, let me speak, getting all celebratory about Brexit. Of course, Brexit was one of only two significant issues to happen on the 31st of January 2020.
Yes. The other one, shall I give a bit of a hint? Shall I play a bit of a hint?
Go on, play a bit while I let my dog in, and that's not a euphemism.
I am Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
And live means...
Live. Our first live podcast.
Oh, isn't it fantastic? So any of our guests before who have been on our extraordinarily fantastic, but perhaps slightly lower tech setup than we've got tonight, might be impressed at the microphones and lighting and all sorts that are needed for a live broadcast.
Yes. And I've just realised something. Should we stick? Because I didn't. You know what? In true style, you know what I didn't do? I didn't press record.
Right. Shall we try that again then?
Yeah. So let's between us, let's just call
any of us that were live. Pretend it never happened.
Shh, that bit didn't happen. Now.
And we'll go in 5, 4.
Oh, hang on. Like I say, more buttons than the Starship Enterprise.
It wasn't like this at ITN, I can tell you.
It really wasn't, because I'm more careful about what sorts of things I tweet.
There was less casual racism.
Yeah. Right. So I'm not sure what the comment about the tweeting was, but that was a big thing that happened for us 5 years ago. Yes.
And yes, amazing to think that was 5 years ago, and we were in the studio.
Yes.
Which was, in fact, your front
room.
My
front room, yes.
And only a few short months after you had got everything set up with boom mics and halo lights and all the good stuff, bloody pandemic kicked in and we had to move remote. And we've never gone back, have we? I'm still sat in my office at home, we've made it work over 5 years.
We have. We haven't got some landlord that basically owes a wealthy landowner a load of money, so needs to have a building occupied, trying to force us to come back into the office. Oh, sorry, different subject.
Different subject.
To be fair, yes, apart from that being our first ever live stream, and you can see just how kind of cobbled together that was that night, that literally just being sent through Facebook Live. Since then, we streamed to different places. But there was an event, of course. I know we've teased, but there was an event, of course, that caused us to decide, in our own insanity, to take to the airwaves for, I think, for an audience of all of 2 people at the time. At 11 o'clock on a Monday. Was it a Monday evening? I think it was a Monday evening.
It was a Monday evening. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. No, and so much has changed and so much has stayed the same in terms of that first thing from our perspective. There was the false start on the technology, and there are very few weeks go by where Simon doesn't say to me, "Look, don't worry, I've completely rewired everything. I've stuck a spoon into the mixing desk and poured a mug of Ovaltine over it, but I'm pretty sure it won't make any difference." So the technical challenges still persist, but we've got a few episodes out since then, and we've had some guests as well, haven't we? I think we've had 2 MPs, police and crime commissioner, deputy police and crime commissioner, and a whole host of local political luminaries who have come and joined us over the time. So I'd like to think we've covered a few bases.
We have indeed, and just to assure MJM78, although we may look like Maltesers, we're definitely not EDL members. So apologies for any assumptions that may have been made there. But yeah, we did before basically Rona did for us what it did for everyone else, and send us all scurrying to Zoom. And other forms of virtual platforms, other forms of virtual platforms are available, so we've invited many people round to have a biscuit or to have a cup of tea and to talk through local politics with us. But since then, it's all been done remotely, and that's actually been great guns. But yes, that night. Did anything massive happen? I can't remember. Did we have like a chiming of the clock at 11 o'clock and expect the world to end, or something different to say?
We did, and I think we checked outside to see whether anything significant had happened, and nothing did. And I guess so. When we look back over the last 5 years, it's one of those. It's an interesting thing, isn't it, in terms of Brexit, in that there was so much passion at the time, and we'll come on to talk about there still seems to be so much passion now. And again, even if we look at we got a few comments below the Facebook post, which most people seem to misinterpret. There still appears to be quite a lot of emotion. Almost feels still quite raw for quite a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that's understandably so, because I mean, it's the biggest political event that's happened. Certainly happened in my lifetime, and considering how much a disagreement that there's been over one side or the other, and how long it took different prime ministers or different flavours of Conservative prime ministers to get Brexit done, for want of a better phrase. If that's a registered phrase, I'm not paying him any money. Then I don't know. I thought I wouldn't have been able to. I thought I would have been overwhelmed by the constant celebrations of all of the things that have gone so well. But in reality, that's not happened. But at the same time, it's also a non-conversation. So it seems a really weird thing.
I guess is it worth us just going back a little bit, because I don't want to be. I'm going to be blindly optimistic here and suggest that we might have some listeners that weren't with us from the very start, to kind of recap our own positions on. That the whole podcast was born out of the Brexit debate.
Yeah.
And so, I guess, my position was that I would have preferred to remain. I was no great lover of the EU. I didn't like it as an institution, but there was always a view from my perspective that the pain of leaving was going to be worse than the sort of gentle inconvenience of staying. So I guess, at that point, it made me one of those sort of strange people within the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party was split at the time. And I was, again, I took some heat at the time for doing well, that's a cowardly approach. There was also a little bit of self-interest there. I was never shy about explaining that I was in a very well-paid pharmaceutical manufacturing job at the time, and I believed that should we leave the EU, that would spell the end for my employment, which it did. The plant closed and moved to Belgium. So there was an element from a personal perspective. I voted to remain. Woke up, was surprised to see that we had voted to leave, as I think were quite a large proportion of the leave camp. And I guess from my perspective, which got me some heat on social media, my view at that point was it was a heads or tails call. I called heads, it landed tails, and at that point we sort of had to get on with it. And therein lies so many Facebook arguments and getting banned from the odd group and having to go and sit on the naughty step as I interacted with people. But I'd like to think I'm a more mellow man now than I was.
You are?
Oh yeah, definitely,
Okay.
definitely. For those of you who don't have the video, I am my small cat is sat with me, which I'm stroking James Bond villain style. So take from that what you will.
Yes. We were expecting you to vote to stay, Mr. Britton. Yeah, I mean, I also voted Remain. Indeed, I lightly campaigned for Remain, and if I'm honest, I still hold the view that it always was the wrong solution to a different problem, and wasn't a good idea, and wasn't going to provide us with the things that those that were selling it were going to, and I'd have loved to have been. I wasn't right about everything because that's just not the nature of life. But at the same time, I think sadly the government decided to descend into internecine warfare and not understand what it was that it was trying to do with itself, fight itself. How many prime ministers? Well, by the time we'd left, we were on our third prime minister, weren't we? Because we lost Cameron and then we lost Theresa May.
And I think that's an interesting point just to pause there for a second, because a lot of the ranting on Facebook in the aftermath was bloody Tories dragging us out of Europe. And I do occasionally point out that Cameron rather led the Remain campaign, and you can say that he didn't lead it very well. And you can say that his counterpart, Jeremy Corbyn, didn't lead his side of the equation very well. But, you're right. It did for Cameron. Theresa, do you remember those confirmatory votes with Theresa May?
the endless confirmatory votes. I mean, the trouble is that it was a yes/no question. And actually, when it came down to it, there was more than one particular way and one particular interpretation of what that answer meant. If you asked three different people that were campaigners in support of leaving the EU, you'd get four different answers about actually what voting to leave meant. I mean, Daniel Hannan famously went on Channel 4 and said that no one was talking about leaving the customs union or leaving the single market, which of course we were, because that's the nature of what the arrangement was that we were in at the time. And no one was talking about that creating a border in the Irish Sea, which of course, and essentially and administratively, it has. So there are. I'm not going to run through the kind of the list, because it's our mainstay is that we're not trying to be point scoring about it. We're trying to. Our conversation today also recognises that the first ever episode that we recorded that we never aired was us trying to discuss Brexit, and it was just a shit show of us arguing.
Yeah, it was nearly 2 hours, I think, of an absolute. That one is very much. I
needed a bigger SD card.
Yeah, that one is very much in the dark archives, and we'll never see the light of day. So it did prove to us we needed a little bit more structure. And I guess if we look at it now, Simon, I've got this theory on my 5 tribes theory.
Okay, what's
Uh,
this?
so my five tribes theory is that 5 years on,
Hmm.
that the kind of the whole kind of issue was settled into five tribes, and the first is, which you touched on there, is the ardent Brexiteer, which is, well, that's not what I voted for. I can't believe the EHRC can still have a hand in British politics. It's a disgrace. Our governments have sold us out. That wasn't what I voted for. That ain't a proper Brexit. We need to vote for somebody else who'll properly take us out and build that wall in the English Channel so none of them boats can come across. That is my tribe one.
Okay, are we calling them anything in particular, like sunlit uplands or?
You can name them as you will, and I guess Um, I guess on the opposite side of that, my tribe on the other side are a similarly small group who basically convince each other that rejoin is what the British people want. Not only was it a terrible idea to leave the EU, that everything would be better if we rejoined, and there's a real appetite, and the majority of the country want to rejoin. Let's start campaigning now. So, and those are the kind of two extremes. And then I guess if you step sort of inside those, there is the Brexiteers who are still in celebratory mood for Brexit, which is Brexit's happened. It was all worth it. It's a great thing. We are once again rule makers, not rule takers. The talons of Brussels have been extracted from our buttocks. Hooray for everything. Um, And on the other side of it, there is well, it's been a bit cold and wet since Brexit, and I keep losing my keys. I never lost my keys when we were in the EU. So you got four tribes there, and I think they're all quite small but quite vocal. The fifth tribe
I
is
feel like
pretty much
if we had the money for the copyrights, we'd play a Frankie Goes to Hollywood song there.
yeah. We need to redub it to five tribes, but I think the massive tribe in the middle is, oh, for God's sake, can we stop talking about this? We definitely don't want to run the debate again. We kind of are where we are. Can we all just shut up about it? Do you think that's where the majority are at?
I mean, I think people got very. I think you're right that the majority of people have been in that position over the last couple of years. But I think as time's gone on, the effects are demonstrating themselves more and more, and the promises that were made have not translated into things. There've been 9 years to try and reach this fantastic mystical trade agreement with the US, and that seems even further away than. I think it's more likely that Keir Starmer's going to be able to convince Donald Trump to rename one of his children Starmer than actually reach a trade agreement with the UK at the moment, because he keeps talking trade wars and tariffs and stuff. All of the other agreements that are around the world don't seem to have been significantly any better than the ones that we had as members of the EU with other countries, and if anything, have kind of lowered standards. They seem to have stuffed farmers, stuffed fishermen. So I don't want all of. I'm just conscious that I'm kind of selling the negatives. I'm just conscious that if this was such a fantastic thing, where are all these people? Where's Farage isn't short of words to say, is he? Where's Johnson? He's never short of a word to say, especially when someone's trying to pay him, reminding us of all of these fantastic things. All of these fantastic things should be self-evident, and unfortunately they're not. And to me, the crying shame is that it's the small businesses that have been harmed from trying to export to the EU, that have lost 500 million customers, or the ability to trade with them really easily without loads of paperwork, or all the vacancies in the NHS, or the vacancies that farmers have from all of those things. I just think that sadly none of those promises turned out to be true, and as lot of the argument at the time was very passionate, wasn't it? It was about, oh, you're this or that, and therefore you are or aren't a patriot, and therefore you are or aren't someone that's intimately related to a flag. But I do consider myself a patriot because I want the best thing for my country. I'm utterly convinced, and don't see any evidence that tells me otherwise, that actually it has sadly been an act of harm. And now I don't think in my lifetime we're gonna kind of see a rejoin, but it does seem that the words off of finding some way to remove or reduce those barriers is the only sensible and practicable way to move forward. But who knows? If anyone anyone watching wants to add their comment as to what they're celebrating from the last 5 years, that would be great, or their thoughts. But yeah, what were you going to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my only, and this is an observation, because my position is that the leaving the EU was going to create, my position hasn't changed. It was going to make things more difficult. It was going to make more trade more difficult. And I've always held the belief that it was going to be in the EU's interest to make trade more frictionful with the UK once it had left, even if that was detrimental to the EU. Because my belief was always, and that this is where I never had an inherent trust in the EU, that it actually made things better for the ordinary people of the European Union. I spent quite a lot of time with work in Brussels, and it felt like there were an awful lot of very expensive restaurants and very nice hotels and lots of S-Class Mercedes on, EU kind of plates zipping about the city. So there was always I always had this feeling that it was one of those things where, money got pumped into it and 60% of the money got pumped back out again. So I was never convinced that what came to pass economically in terms of those trade barriers. I think they have been harmful. My overall view is that in terms of the question, I guess, is has it been worth it? And as I say, I kind of I sit very much in the kind of, well, I don't know camp, and I don't know whether I can trust anybody to do the working out. And you and I have both worked in sort of continuous improvement environments, and the thing that always comes into my mind is that if without a pandemic and without the Ukraine war, the only major shock to the UK system would have been Brexit. So for me, it would have been much clearer to really be able to quantify the impact of it, which I accept, I think probably has been negative from a trade perspective. But I just don't know whether it's possible to quantify the impact. Oh.
Yeah, sorry, that was me just trying to reply to someone on LinkedIn. So, yeah, I can. Yeah, I mean, I get if you were trying to look at two different sets of data, you want clean data where in Group A there was only this thing happening, and in Group B there wasn't this thing happening, and there were no other things. But all of those other things that happened, the coronavirus and Ukraine war, happened in all of those other groups as well. So yes, all of the problems that we've got now aren't only aren't only because of Brexit. And I think anyone that is trying to claim that, to be honest, needs to give their head a bit of a wobble, because that's clearly not the case. There've been other things that have happened. My point is that Brexit has exacerbated most of them, not all of them, but most of them. And I think that had we not, at a time of what we didn't know was going to be massive instability. Instability. It just felt like that was wrong. Massive instability. We'd actually decided to, just before two major impacts against stability, and against key kind of wholesale prices and markets and all sorts of things. just ahead of those two very, very big impacts, we'd unknowingly decided to impose a massive dent in our own stability and our own financial stability. And as the saying goes, essentially we voted to impose sanctions on ourselves because we owe, we're not overnight, but we owe because of that change.
Yeah.
We went from having some very beneficial deals with the countries around the world as a member of the EU that quite happily, as a grouping of 600 million citizens, had a bigger weight than a country of 60, 70 millions. I'm sorry, that's just math.
Yeah.
So that was the thing, is that I was never of the camp of everything's awful because of Brexit. I'm just saying, actually, a lot of things were probably even a little bit worse because of it.
Yeah, and I think interesting. I was this morning. I was on Koonsberg. They covered some of the sort of economic growth data of the last 12 months, and the UK grew by 0.1%, which was pretty feeble. The average across the EU was 0.1%. But interestingly, some EU countries, probably most of the smaller countries, seem to do quite well. But if you looked at Germany, France, and Italy, they all did less well in terms of that economic growth. So I think there is definitely, that there is definitely something to be said for, trying to reduce the friction in trade, because, ultimately, if we look back at some of those stories, there'll be chlorinated chicken from the US, and there'll be all sorts of deteriorations in standards. In broad terms, the UK and EU standards on everything still remain pretty much aligned. So there is definitely something that if there is a mindset between the two organisations to look at where we have standards alignment to reduce friction on trade, it feels like it can be done. I just wonder whether the terms and conditions of that, which which will be presented by one side as rolling over and playing tickle my tummy, and the bureaucrats will tell us how straight our cucumbers are allowed to be. I wonder whether there is, whether both sides can get to a more pragmatic position.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the trouble is that part of it is political and part of it is practical. And from a practical level, there has to be an agreement to be made where, if not across the board, then maybe on certain sectors, then we can agree to maintain alignment. Now, in those sectors, that would make us a rule taker rather than a rule maker. However, in some sectors, it's definitely in our interest to still have easy access to 500 million customers, and that we can trade with as if they were whales. That's certainly in our interest. And I guess that sort of bespoke some bits in, some bits out deal, which is the sort of deal that Switzerland has with the EU. To be honest, they're quite kind of, they have a succession of bilateral agreements, which incidentally the EU is trying to get them to not do because it's a pain in the bum. That conversation could be had, and maybe there's that argument there. I do think that some of this is politically toxic, and some of the things that are probably needed to be done are difficult then for the government to do. But to be fair, at the moment, they've got a stonking majority. So if they can do them quickly and have them in place before the next general election, when they might take a bit of a pounding, because a lot of this, although they've got a massive majority in seats, a lot of them have actually got quite narrow majorities. So they're at risk of losing some of those. So they might end up in a second term where either they've got a much reduced majority, or indeed they might end up relying on other parties to confidence of supply or coalition. The dreaded C word. I can see Liberal Democrats shivering up and down the country with the mention of the word coalition. But there's more than one way to skin a cat, as I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that on
Yeah.
one hand, you'll have for want of a better phrase, the European purists that would want to get back into the EU as quickly as possible. And I can see that argument. And the longer we take, the greater the danger that we diverge. And the more we will diverge, the harder that would be. So there's that kind of argument. And on the other hand, there's the Brexit purists of this wasn't a real Brexit. It's not really been done. You've lied to me. We've not done all the things that we should have done, despite we've not got any sign of a sniffing agreement with the US and all of the things that I said earlier on about the trade agreements that we have been able to make. The reality's got to be somewhere in the middle, right? There's got to be something that fits those sort of circumstances. And if we are over the course of time on a slow and painful path back into the EU, if that's what the country decides it wants to do in the very future, for me the most immediate thing are the critical problems that cause issues for businesses with exporting, problems for farmers, with exporting, and fishermen with exporting, but also with farmers with kind of access to temporary labour. Those those things can all be kind of thrashed out without you necessarily having to sign up to all of the four freedoms of the freedom of movement, of goods, services, and money. So I think there's something to be had. It's just a shame that it's been made such a toxic issue that we can't have a reasonable conversation about it without someone shouting from one corner of the internet about it being a betrayal.
Yeah, I guess the only other, and just an angle that I do wonder whether we explore is, we see the EU as, there was talk, wasn't there, about, the UK will be first and others will follow. Well, nobody has. But I do wonder, with the rise of in the further slash far right in certain countries in Europe, whether whether the EU will be able to hang together, in its current form, because there is a lot of the noise that is coming from those parties in Germany and Austria and France is quite anti everything rhetoric, but a lot of that is about the EU and effectively the citizens of our country are underfunded, underinvested in, and we give all this money away to these smaller countries within the EU. Um, it- do you think the EU is rock solid and kind of here to stay for the foreseeable?
Yes, is the simple answer to that. But I think you're absolutely right that the EU in its current form won't continue because it never has. It's always been an evolving organisation. When you look at what it was as the EEC, or you look at what there was in 1975.
Common market.
It formed of the common market, and actually it originally formed of the need to coordinate purchasing of coal and steel, so that it essentially made it so that no European country could amass as much coal and steel that it would need in order to be able to go to war with another one. So if you
Simpler
kind of
times.
Yeah, well, it was at the time, but that's the kind of thing, so it has always been evolving. So it will always need to evolve. And I think the biggest betrayal, if you like, of Brexit is that, for me, is that we will all, and it was actually, to paraphrase Margaret Thatcher, so I'm probably going to get hated from both ends of the political spectrum for this. But it was Margaret Thatcher that said, we can pretend not to be involved with Europe. I'm paraphrasing her probably really awfully here.
Yeah.
If we like, but we will be affected by what decisions are made in Europe and what happens in Europe, because we're right next to it and we want to trade with it. So to not have a say is really short-sighted. And essentially, of all of the things that woman said and did, that's a statement that I agree entirely with the sentiment of. I mean, I know she did in later years lots of arms folding and no with regards to the EU. But I think if you've spent any time going around the history of Europe in Brussels, it's a fantastic building and lots of lovely history about actually how the EU came about and all of the stresses and strains and trials and tribulations that happened. Yes, it will continue to evolve, because what it is now will not suit the future. So I think there is, but I don't think there's any danger of this, oh, well, we'll just be the fragmentation, because ironically, despite as much as the Farage and Hannan and the likes of those saying that, well, we'll be out the door and then others will follow, what we've actually demonstrated is, rather than it being easy to leave and that everything's brilliant outside, their Brexit has actually demonstrated how bloody awful it is and how difficult it is to do and how it isn't worth it. Even Le Pen is stopped talking about leaving Europe. So even the most kind of right wing, slightly more nutty parts of European politics have stopped saying about leaving the European Union, and Hungary is just kind of playing the things of, well, it's too difficult for you to get rid of me, so I'm just going to be as much of a pain in the arse as I possibly can.
Well, and I think that's the interesting piece, isn't it? Because I think there are certain member states who to use that kind of that euphemism.
Euphemism. Sorry, that was beautiful.
Euphemism.
Yeah, I got you.
I'm not sure I'd want to be part of a club that allowed them in. And Hungary and Poland, Poland with their sort of treatment of the LGBTQ community, which I think is even more prevalent when you see what's going on the other side of the pond. I do. Again, we're a little off topic here, but it does worry me that there is a club where members can behave despicably, and there's almost a we'll just sweep that under the carpet.
That's the thing. I don't think that the EU's response is sweeping it under the carpet, because they stopped funding certain things in countries that, for quote unquote, for better phrases, misbehave. They've stopped the EU funding of certain things because they won't give EU money to basically to things that aren't actually compliant with EU values. But the irony is to a certain degree, that actually plays into the narrative of the likes of Orban and the likes of, some of the more kind of, for want of a better word, the spotty kind of, UKIP types that would be, whether the EU are trying to dictate what what we would have now called wokeism. Then that wasn't even a thing. Ironically, trying to enforce a quote unquote standard or a common set of values is precisely the attack of our sovereignty thing. But at the same time, if you're a group, you're a group. But it's that. This is the thing: is that I think the UK decided to join a business agreement, decided to join a trading agreement, and we didn't take the opportunity to take the public with us and understand why it was necessary and it was in our benefit to continue to remain in that organization as it evolved beyond being that. And that created the vacuum in which the Farages of this world were able to sell, and Johnson was able to sell lots of lies in papers about bananas and about cucumbers, that made them feel, that made them loads of money, or gave them lots of political power and stuff. I just wanted to come back to just to kind of put a pin in that part of the conversation. We did have a comment about talking about the tariffs. So I just wanted to kind of reach that. So Drunk Delilah Brewery said the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, is set to end with a 5-year review, so which kept trade pretty much the same as pre-Brexit. So it's due for renegotiation this year. So we could, this is I guess then the point that we could start to see tariffs if an agreement isn't made. So I guess that's why there's this natural kind of there's this natural renegotiation point So, but I also think that we'd be bonkers to think that the EU is up for spending another 3 years in
Yeah.
British navel gazing. They'll probably just tell us to look. Can you possibly sort your shit out and come back when you know what you actually want?
Yeah, and I guess the other thing, seeing as we've touched on tariffs, is obviously we've got
Boris Trump's Donald's favourite word, the T word. Apparently,
tariffs. A beautiful thing, the most beautiful
beautiful
thing in the
word.
world. So,
Beautiful word.
beautiful word. So he's whacked 25% on Canada and Mexico and 10% on China. I don't know what China did to get a discount. And then I saw footage in the week when he was asked about the EU that his words were, the EU has done terrible things to America, and they pushed him on, well, will you be imposing tariffs? And yes, was his answer. And I guess that's going to be it, and again, who can know the mind of? But I guess and that's where it could be interesting if the Donald opts to put tariffs onto the EU, but his new mate Starmer, they're in a little bit bromance earlier this week. We finally mentioned his name. It'd be very interesting if the UK didn't get tariffs put on us.
So I think see that, and I think that's an interesting point because the UK always seemed like a cultural and diplomatic bridge between the US and Europe. That always seemed to be our function to serve, and possibly to a degree militarily as well, I guess, and intelligence. But can we be that again, considering how much we've pissed off our nearest neighbours, and how disloyal he can be? But he seems to have a really particular thing for the royal family and seems to hold them in high regard. It's interesting that he who must not be named, who owns X, has fallen a bit silent of late about matters British. Did you notice that?
Well, I did. Well, I mean, I don't follow. I came off of X myself because it was at a point where, again, I was much more interested in sport and funny and the rampaging ranting of what got pushed into my feed. I just thought, oh, yeah, I can live without this in my life. So X did stage left. So no, the fact is that Mr. Musk and his mutterings of madness seem to have fallen quiet. So no, and I guess this is the trouble, isn't it? When you're, you know, I think Nikki, my wife, your sister, has said quite often with these things, it's like playing chess with a pigeon.
Yes.
Which is that it doesn't matter how you play the game, the pigeon is going to knock all of the pieces over, shit on the board, and then tell you that it's won.
Yes.
So you kind of, you've kind of just got to roll with it at the moment. And I think, I just coming back to a point you made about Labour and you can look at that through the lens of, if Labour did want to force through closer links with the EU, which wouldn't have been a very Corbyn thing to do. 7 out of 10, as I recall. I guess the one thing that would do would give, absolute grist to the mill of reform. But then I do wonder, and it's my muse, whether actually politically it would probably be better for Labour to throw reform a handful of grist to keep the vote split on the right.
Well, that's the old chess adage of you play 3 moves ahead or whatever it is, which I can never quite manage. So yeah, I mean that's an interesting dynamic. That's some of the bit that kind of boggles my brain is that to a degree the government seem to be behaving as if they're really on their skids and they can't really get anything done, but they've got a massive majority. I mean, yes, there's no money, and basically the economy's in the toilet, and the Conservatives seem to be on a different varieties of planet Loon, to be really honest with you. But I don't quite understand why they're not. I don't expect them to be, kind of celebrating and everything's going to be better now in the same way that when Blair came to power in '97. It's definitely not that environment. But from a point of view of, could we just kind of understand that actually, yeah, we do have some ideas about how to make things a bit better for people, and we've got some ideas, and some of it's going to take a little while to do, but we've got this. I don't quite know. Maybe, but again, we do live in a world where there is a constant barrage of media that is absolutely fuming that the Conservatives lost the election, despite it being quite clear that they deserved to, because everything that they'd fucked up in the previous period, including doing themselves over. They just obviously weren't really fit to continue governing, surely. And most people in July voted anything but you. Didn't they really?
And again, beautiful stat. I love a stat.
Okay.
And the fact is that Labour, didn't get any more votes. They got very similar to less than they got in 2017, almost exactly the same as what they got in 2019, and ended up with 400 odd seats. It's an oddity of the system that
one could argue that just points to first past the post being
well, and I hear you ripping the lid off an economy family-sized tin of worms are there, getting ready to empty them on the table. But I'm going to have to raise a hand and say stop, so that this Brexit episode does not turn into an hour and a half of based ranting. No, I think there is a piece where, if we just close out on these discussions with the EU, I believe they're starting tomorrow. It would be ideal if we get to more frictionless trade. I do, who can know what will happen with the tariffs from America and not, and I've got to be honest with you, Simon. Sometimes we can be a bit insular in the UK. When I saw those figures and I went and did a little bit more looking around sort of how the rest of the economies in the developed world are doing, your kind of phrase of, the economy's in the toilet. I think that's not an unfair statement, but it's not the only. And again, I don't want to be the race to the bottom toilet. We are getting there, but it's kind of everyone else is in a similar small boat crossing the channel. I've mixed so many metaphors.
Yeah, you've mixed so many metaphors, and you've gone for the small boats across the channel thing, which is just
exactly.
Oh man,
exactly. So you were going to rip your head off. You were going to do the PR thing. I'm doing the boats across the channel thing. We'll both tell each other to stop.
Yes. So shall we close out by just saying what we're celebrating of the lot? Have we got any? What's our things that we want to celebrate from the last 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there is a, I am. If I look at the last 5 years, it's been a tough period. It is that element of, so soon after we recorded that episode, the impact of COVID, a global pandemic, the war in Ukraine. This is a run up to a celebration. I get you. The fact is, we're still here. And for the vast majority of people, life's pretty good. And we do tend to the miserable. Misery loves company. And
every Sunday, 6:27.
Yeah. I always get your chuckly little nature. And the fact is, we're still finding things to talk about, and we're still getting people coming on. And yeah, that's my celebration piece. We're still here. We're still going, and we haven't fallen out completely yet.
No, I think as for me, the celebrations would be that actually, if I try to remember how it's felt over different parts of the last 5 years, there have been times where it actually felt that we were on the brink of essentially the breakdown of our democratic process and of our democratic system. And there are many people that would agree, that will decry that democracy wasn't working, and they would decry that from either side of the argument. For me, the fact that Parliament couldn't agree was actually a democratic reflection of actually the narrowness of the vote, and the vagueness with which the question that was asked didn't give any clue as to which particular flavour or which particular interpretation that actually meant. And we've talked on other occasions about how there are better ways to ask questions where you don't want just a binary answer, but you can actually kind of get things that are specific and ordered in preference and stuff like that. So for me, actually, fundamentally, there's a celebration that, you know what, it's been painful, and actually there has been damage, and there is still a fundamental mistrust in politics in this country. For me, the celebration is that didn't go as far as at times it looked like we were on the track to go.
Yep.
Yes, I will celebrate that actually the worst predictions of what would happen when we left did not come true. And to me, that's a good thing. Anyone that was reveling in that idea, I'm sorry, get your head read. And I'd like to celebrate that actually running a country by 3-word slogans and press releases and deception and guffawing hasn't worked. And actually, that meant that Johnson didn't stay in office, and that meant that the party that had enabled that and allowed that also didn't stay in office. The public had enough of that. And for me, we should, as much as there is lots of disagreement and there is lots of division, there are still lots of things that we do agree about. We want the country to be better and we want the country to do well. It's just that there's lots of disagreement on what well looks like and how we get from where we are. But I think that things could have been worse.
And on that note, the discussions of what we should do and how we get there will continue to keep us going, hopefully for another 5 years. You've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. 5 years on, I am still Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm still Simon Sansbury, and we'll see you next week at 6:27. Do remember to like, follow, comment, subscribe, so that you can get some notifications about what our next shows are about, or indeed go to our website to sign up for our newsletter so you can get some information about that and help us write questions in future. And that would be pppodcast.uk. We'll see you next week. Don't forget to like, follow and comment on Facebook, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. Find us on all the social media platforms: Facebook, X, YouTube, Threads, LinkedIn.